Podcast, your weekly dose of conservative news brought to you by Restoration of America. I'm your host, Hayden Ludwig, Research Director for Restoration News. Be sure to find our work at restoration-news.com. Today we're joined by Daniel Di Martino, a survivor of Venezuelan socialism who's dedicated his life to defending America's constitutional liberties from those who would destroy them. That includes the pro-Hamas protesters infecting our nation's college campuses today. Daniel, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start by talking about your background. You know, you were born in Venezuela. You're an immigrant in the United States. Tell us about your experience and your story.
Yeah, well, I came to America in 2016, and I did so because Venezuela was totally destroyed by socialism, by a regime that a president that was elected a month before I got into office. The Venezuelan people elected somebody Hugo Chavez, who decided to expropriate most large businesses and medium-sized companies, who redistributed income, right? Who gave people free housing, free food, free electricity, free water, education, healthcare, even free gasoline. And all that money had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was paid for through printing money and inflation. And so as a result, my family went from making several $1,000s a month, like most American middle-class families, to making $100 a month by the year I left Venezuela.
Wow.
And so I knew that I had no future in that country, and I was really blessed to, I had already learned English. I loved America. I looked up to the freedom that people had here. And I got secured a full ride scholarship to study here, and that's how I came. And for me, this country has been a great blessing, just like it has been for so many millions of others. And so I'm very grateful for that. And I'm also very conscious of the fragility of the freedoms and therefore prosperity that we have here.
Let's talk about the collapse of Venezuela. It was once a beautiful, wealthy country, still geographically, of course, is quite beautiful. Then you point out Hugo Chavez came in and started to dismantle everything, starting with private property and a complete government takeover of everything. And yet we're told by those on the left that Venezuela's collapsed because inflation that has nothing to do with his economic policies or an over-reliance on oil exports. But you point out that the real culprit here is socialism. Explain that.
Well, I think the best counter-argument to any other excuse for what happened in Venezuela is, have you ever met a refugee from Dubai? Do people escape the countries in the Arab Gulf when oil prices go down? Have you ever met people escaping Qatar? And it's not because those places are wonderful free nations, right? Women have no rights. There's not even a democracy. There's no voting for people. Yet 90% of the population of Dubai is actually an immigrant. People go to Dubai despite them not having political rights, because despite depending on oil, despite being a desert, they can't even grow food. In Venezuela, we say that we can throw a seed off the highway and a tree will grow because we're a tropical nation. Yet people starve to death in Venezuela. They don't starve to death in other countries. The difference is not oil. The difference isn't even weather. Weather is to our advantage. The difference is the policies implemented by the people in power. And those policies were the destruction of private property. Those policies were printing money to pay for government spending. And those policies were price controls and really over-regulation of private business.
Yeah, that's right. Well, like we said, it went from a pretty forward-looking, successful South American country to a failed state. We would call that national suicide. And yet people voted for that. This was not a hostile takeover like we saw in the Cold War in many countries like Nicaragua, the Civil War, for instance. Why on earth did the Venezuelan people change their minds like that? I'm sure they regret it now, but what happened?
Exactly. What makes Venezuela a special case, and one that we in the United States need to be really mindful and learn from, is that Venezuelans elected Hugo Chavez initially. Russians never elected Lenin, the Chinese never elected Mao, and the Cubans never elected Castro. There's been no other socialist regime that's been elected into power and remain in power like Venezuela's. But that's the question, right? They get elected into power democratically. It's democratic socialism by definition. Yet they can't leave power democratically. Now Venezuelans have been under the same government for 25 years, over 25, all my life. And there's no endpoint because the people have no guns. They have no money to actually face the regime. And socialism, even though it began as a true ideology, like the government officials actually believed in it, in true equality of result, it's not an ideology anymore they actually subscribe to, but a tool. It's what President Trump mentioned, that the problem with socialism is not that it doesn't work, but that it works perfectly. And that's exactly what the Venezuelan regime thinks today. Socialism is a tool to keep the population poor and under their control. It's not because they think it's a good thing. They know it's a bad thing, but it allows them to remain in power.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, it's the same thing in every communist country, right? That the idea of socialism dies in the hearts of the people generations, decades before it actually collapses in reality. Now, we have Democrats who in this country who have sung the praises of the Chavez and Maduro regimes for a quarter century now, the same way, some of the older folks remember Jane Fonda singing the praises of the North Vietnamese communists, 60 years ago. And yet, they're obviously hiding the reality of the people like yourself who've lived through this and desperately want to escape it. Do you think that Americans, on average, are even aware of how bad it is in Venezuela or the causes behind that depression and collapse?
No. Well, there's only been one poll that I've seen that asked Americans what they thought or if they knew anything about Venezuela. And it was only about half of Americans were even aware slightly about a crisis going on in Venezuela. So, half of the country just isn't aware at all. And the people who are aware, many of them are probably misled as well. And so it is certainly something that we need to educate about, and it's something I do through my organization, the Dissident Project. We send people like myself from Venezuela, but also people from Cuba, from North Korea, from Eritrea, Zimbabwe, to speak at high schools to tell their stories and educate the younger generation about the value of being free and being American. It's true that there's a long history of people on the left in the U.S. being apologetics for foreign tyrannical regimes. Heck, the New York Times was hiding the Holodomor and other hunger and famines happening in the Soviet Union as early as the 1920s. When people say the New York Times became fake news recently, it's not recent. There've been 100 years of fake news, the New York Times. And so
that's right, and that was I believe that was Walter Duranty, right, who covered up for the Soviet Union's intentional mass starvation of millions of Ukrainians. By the way, there's a great movie on that called Mr. Jones about a reporter who gets caught behind that line. I'm glad you know it. It's an incredible story. But anyway, please continue.
And that reporter got killed after showing the world the truth. The Soviets killed him. And that's the way these regimes operate. And today in the US, we have actually dangerous people who are supporting this regime and are trying to implement those policies in America. And the voters are just the useful, puppets of this ideology. Let me give you an example. Chesa Boudin was San Francisco's district attorney. From 2020 until he got recalled, because not even the San Franciscan population was supportive of him after 2 years of failure. Imagine a city that is 95% Democrat recalls their Democrat district attorney. He was Hugo Chavez's translator in Venezuela. He wrote two books actually about Venezuela. One is called The Venezuelan Revolution, 100 Questions, 100 Answers, and the other one is called Gringo, a coming of age in Latin America. This is a guy who doesn't have good intentions. Then we have people in the US Congress today who are calling for the US to lift sanctions on the Maduro regime. They think that people are fleeing Venezuela because of sanctions. We're not fleeing because of sanctions. There are plenty of sanctioned countries. And I'll give you one example of another evil country that is very sanctioned but doesn't suffer like Venezuela, and it's Iran. Iran is an oil exporting nation, one of the greatest oil producers in the world. Iran is a totalitarian regime. It's Islamist, unlike Venezuela. In Iran, you don't have religious freedom, unlike in Venezuela. In Iran, if a woman doesn't wear a burqa or a headscarf, then she is stoned to death, perhaps. Yet, why aren't there millions of Iranians fleeing to Turkey next door? They have a border. Turkey is a much more secular, free, prosperous nation. People don't
Yeah.
understand why, right? And the reason is because Iran might be oppressive, might be everything, even that Venezuela is not, but Iran is not a socialist country. In Iran, you can start a business and you won't starve to death. You can get a job and lead a normal life, even if you don't have political freedoms or social freedoms. In Venezuela, you will starve to death. And that is the number one reason people flee.
You've painted this fascinating history of over 100 years, more like 120 years now, of Americans and Westerners covering for the grievous sins of what's going on in socialist and communist countries overseas, while importing the same radical ideology into our institutions and indoctrinating our young people in the universities. I mean, let's not forget, Hollywood was taken over in the 30s and 40s. I mean, we all remember the Red Scare of the 1950s. Well, there were plenty of apologists in Hollywood who were good-hearted liberals, not leftists, not progressives, old-fashioned liberals who believed that it was all a lie, that there were communists taking over, until they were shown the actual Communist Party membership cards by Congress and came to believe, wow, no kidding, actually, it's all been taken over. I'm thinking of a couple in particular right now. Ronald Reagan was a huge part of revealing this. And yet this thing is still going on. It's like the Cold War never really died. Do you see that it's the same radical ideology in the United States that it really is in Venezuela and the Soviet Union?
Yeah, well, recently somebody got arrested after the Department of Justice, the FBI, found out that a former U.S. ambassador to Argentina and many other countries, Bolivia, turns out he was a Cuban spy for 40 years, since the Reagan administration through the Bush, Clinton, Bush II, Obama, Trump, Biden. This guy was a spy from the beginning. And there's people like that all over the U.S. government. And I know that sounds like, oh, this is a conspiracy theory. The thing is that it's a conspiracy. It's just not a theory. It's happening. And these foreign governments have an interest in doing so. And so my concern is the voters being deceived, really. It's being deceived by people like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders might sound as if he's honest, but Bernie Sanders supported the Soviet Union. Nobody, yes. No normal person does a honeymoon in the Soviet Union. I'm sorry.
That's right.
No normal person says that bread lines are good and it means that people have something to eat. Would he say that about people going to, free food kitchens or whatever in churches in the U.S.? No, right? He would say, oh, no, people are poor here. But it's fine if it's in Nicaragua or Venezuela.
But Daniel, he says it's democratic socialism, so it's got to be completely different, right? I mean, just like National Socialism is completely different.
Right. Well, it is democratic initially. But the problem is the socialism part, not the democratic part. I support having elected officials and having free and fair elections. I don't support the socialism part. And so the only difference between Bernie and Lenin is the means to get to power, not what they do in power. And many people have told me, well, Daniel, that doesn't matter because the U.S. Constitution will restrain those people. And you have to be very confident, too confident, I would say, to a fault in our institutions, and also not understand risk. Sure, maybe the Constitution will constrain those people, but why would we want them in the first place there? And people forget there are some flaws and some ways to really turn us into a dictatorship, even within the Constitution. You can name as many Supreme Court justices as you want with just 51% of the votes in Congress, which means you can reinterpret the whole Constitution. And perhaps this was a flaw. We should have fixed the number of Supreme Court justices or found a way to make it more independent. But the reality is that today, if somebody really wanted to turn America into a dystopia, they could just pack the Supreme Court, which is exactly what Hugo Chavez did.
Let's talk about the indoctrination that's going on our campuses right now. Most people won't immediately connect the dots about what we're talking about with overseas and Venezuelan socialism to what's going on with the pro-Hamas and pro-Gaza campus protests. But I think you'd agree that really what we need to understand is not so much the issue, but the way that our students have been taught to think in terms of every power dynamic, every relationship is always an oppressor and oppressed. So in this country, for instance, the Jews are a minority, therefore they're the oppressed versus, white males who are in the majority. But when you go to Israel, suddenly the tables are turned and you have Jewish Israelis in the majority. So obviously, according to this dichotomy, they must be the oppressor while the Gaza Palestinians are the oppressed. Is this what you're seeing as a student at Columbia?
Yeah. Well, look, the whole oppressed and oppressor thing has permeated every aspect of life. And that is really unfortunate, right? In Venezuela, the oppressor was rich people and the oppressed was poor people. In the US, they couldn't do the same poor versus rich dichotomy, because the reality is that a lot of Americans want to be rich. And also it wouldn't make a lot of sense, because then America is the oppressor of all the poor countries, which is what they say. But they instead use race, because they know that race is a more prominent social divide in America because of historical reasons. This country had slavery, right? And then segregation. But that ended long ago. And the problem now is that they are trying to blame people today for what people did in the past that have nothing to do with them. And that will never be acceptable in any civilized society, right? In Venezuela, they took people's lands, they took people's businesses, they gave it to the workers, saying that that was going to work well, and it didn't. And that's what they want to do here. They want to do reparations. They want to do affirmative action. They have racial quotas. We still have racial quotas for federal contractors, which is something, by the way, I work at the Manhattan Institute, and we're working to try to overturn that, because that's explicit legal racial discrimination.
Yes,
and
right.
So that is permeated in campuses, in economics, in social sciences, in hard sciences. And you mentioned the Hamas protests. It's even more direct, the involvement of the regimes like Venezuela's in the Hamas protest. In fact, the Wall Street Journal just uncovered this. There's an organization in New York City called the People's Forum. The People's Forum is a Cuban-funded nonprofit that sends their members to train in Cuba. This is all over social media. They have pictures there, even last year meeting Raul Castro and Miguel Diaz-Canel, the current president of Cuba. And this is an organization that hosts events in New York City and trains professional agitators. And those were among the people arrested at Columbia a few weeks ago. Remember that the occupiers of Hamilton Hall, half of them were not even Columbia students. So somebody from outside was leading all these people. And it's this organization called the People's Forum, which I know very closely, because in 2022, when I had already moved to New York City, they brought 3 women who worked for the Maduro regime to speak here. I don't know how those women were granted visas to travel to the United States. I find it unfortunate, but they were. And when they came to speak, I decided to organize a group of Venezuelans to go and protest their event. We also have free speech, right? Not just the people who support Hamas. And we did, and we really crashed it. It was really fun, and told them what we wanted to. But these people have been trying to infiltrate colleges and other organizations for a very long time. And it's time that Americans recognize that there is actually a lot of foreign influence in these bad causes.
Well, infiltrate to lead and direct and further inflame and agitate these things. We know that, for instance, the Black Lives Matter Summer of Love in 2020 was heavily infiltrated by agents of the Chinese Communist Party. And people are shocked to hear this, but in fact, that's been going on for a very long time. The whole civil rights movement in the 1960s was riddled through with Soviet agents. Now, they did a much more pathetic job trying to infiltrate the American left in the 60s. The Russians were never very good at pulling that off. But the Chinese are very effective at flaming any kind of racial animosity and hatred in this country, which they've been doing for years. It is not surprising then that Cubans would be caught up in the most recent, Occupy New York, Occupy Columbia kind of protests, even though most people wouldn't really connect the dots between Hamas and Palestinians and socialists in Cuba, would they?
Well, the dots is that these countries just want America to fail. They don't care about how or what's the cost. So they're all friends because they have a common enemy, which is the United States and our freedoms. For them, the ideal solution is for the United States to be poor, weak, and go down, really, and become even a tyrannical country too. Because if that happens, then they have free reign to do whatever they want all over the world. What is Cuba's goal? Cuba has been intervening in our countries since Castro came to power. They send soldiers to Congo. They send soldiers to Angola. They send soldiers to Central America. And they took over Venezuela too. Who do you think trained Hugo Chavez? Who do you think helped even the current president of Colombia next to Venezuela, Gustavo Petro? Who do you think trained Lula, the current president of Brazil? They have an organization, it's called the Sao Paulo Forum. This is very well known. I know it all sounds like it's such a crazy thing, but it is real. You know, Ben Shapiro just did an episode about the Sao Paulo Forum too in his YouTube channel. It's an organization founded by Cuba and Venezuela whose explicit goal is to turn all of Latin America into socialist countries like Venezuela. Now imagine what would happen. Well, obviously the refugee wave would be insane, nothing like we've ever seen in the US. And not only that, but all of Americans will become poorer if the rest of the world becomes poorer. What happens in the rest of the world does matter to us directly, not just because of immigration, but also because of trade, because of peace around the world, because these are people who are making their money of drug trafficking. During the Trump administration, Attorney General Barr indicted Maduro and all of his regime with being part of a drug cartel that brings cocaine to the United States and fentanyl. So wow. It's part of everything is connected, unfortunately.
Fentanyl, which of course is the biggest killer of young people 18 to 39 these days. That just happened in the last couple of years. Well, the Sao Paulo Forum, that's not a conspiracy theory. You're right, it's just a conspiracy. It really sounds like it's a recreation of the old Communist International founded by Lenin 100 years ago to do what? To spread the Marxist-Leninist revolution to every country on earth. And Cuba is, and always has been, remains a Marxist-Leninist regime that's extremely interested in exporting its revolution everywhere else, including the United States. And to your point, having these things happen overseas, even countries that we don't think directly affect us, remember that the left and the Democratic Party always cites what's going on in other countries as a model for the future of the United States. We should be more like them because of the great work they're doing overseas over there. Let's go back to these protests, though, for a minute here, Daniel, if we can. You know, it's been now 7 months, roughly, since the October 7th attacks, more like 8 months now, as we get into June. Most people, myself included, you know, as cynical as I can be about these things, were pretty shocked about how long-lasting and widespread these protests are. Now, obviously, it's pretty clear that these things have been well-coordinated and well-funded in advance. We've seen hundreds of the same kinds of Amazon exclusive tents shown up in these tent cities that, you know, those aren't cheap. Who paid for all of that? Do you think most of the students here are aware of how infiltrated these protests are, or were they just there for the vibe?
They're 100% there for the vibe. Of the students, the great majority are just there because they think it's what's cool to do. And this happened now, by the way, in college campuses simply because of the weather. They couldn't do it in the winter semester because it was going to get cold. Imagine if they had done the tents in the middle of winter in New York. It's true that we would have snowed. It would have been too cold for them. Yes. I am 100% sure that's why this didn't happen in December. And they waited until the spring commencement. Let's ruin commencement on top of it. It has nothing to do with Israel. It has nothing to do with human rights in Palestine. Please, you know how many people live in Gaza? It's about 2 million. You know how many Venezuelan refugees, just refugees, not people in Venezuela, live? 8 million. Where are tents and the protest about what's happening in Venezuela? Well, I wouldn't want them because what does Colombia have to do with what happened in Venezuela? Even on their, imagine you really care about Palestine. Imagine you really care about Gaza and you think Israel is terrible. Why would you shut down your own college campus and not protest in front of the Israeli embassy? In Venezuela, you know what we used to do? We blamed Cuba for what happened to our country in great part because they helped the government. So we went and protested in front of the embassy of Cuba. We didn't destroy our own homes. It would be self-defeating. It's not rational because this is not driven by real care for what's happening. This is driven by, you know, a bunch of students want a virtue signal that they're with their friends, and some of the students are being misled by these outside organizations, and it's all about, you know, causing chaos in the US and raising the profile.
Okay, so useful idiots, I think most people listening to the show can understand. But the leadership, yes, it's about chaos, but we're in a presidential election year, and this is a complicated issue for the entire Democratic Party. Let's not forget that relatively pro-Israel, even if they're liberal Jews, and very anti-Israel Muslims make up two very prominent and important constituencies within the Democratic Party and the progressive left. This seems like an electoral loser to me. So help us understand the people organizing this. Are they not aware of this, or are we just missing their more immediate objective?
Yeah, that's also something I've been thinking about. I actually don't think, if you think of it just from an electoral standpoint, the Democrats make no sense in supporting anything related to Gaza and Palestine simply because the number of Muslim voters that actually care about this and would turn their votes is much smaller than the number of Jews that support the Democratic Party in the U.S., right? And yes. And from any standpoint, it's just not, the math just doesn't work. So I think that their goal is short-sighted from an electoral standpoint of the protesters, because they're going to hurt the party that is probably best for them. But on the other hand, their goal could just be policy. They might think that they really have a chance through these events, through these protests, to push people who work in the Biden administration to do what they want while they have time left in office. And so I think that might be the case. Remember, who staffs the Biden administration? That's who makes the decisions. And it's all people who went to Ivy League universities. It's all radical leftists. It's not like their base. And I think that's where all of this comes from.
Yeah, they're willing to sacrifice, Michigan and Minnesota maybe and lose an lose a presidential election in order to hit what they think is the Overton window.
Well, Minnesota, they're not going to lose. But Michigan, they might. Who knows? Yeah. Or they might not, because do you really think that these voters are going to, like, the people who are against Israel are going to go and vote for Trump, who moved the U.S. embassy?
No, but they might not vote at all.
They might not vote. Who knows?
And to your point, why would they do that? Because they view it as, we need to cement control over the Democratic Party in the long run, even if it costs us 4 years under Donald Trump. Just a theory here. Danny, we're running short on time, but tell us, where can people learn more about the Dissident Project?
Yeah, so if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, if you're a high school student, and you would like to bring somebody to your school that came from an authoritarian country, somebody I mentioned, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea. We also have people from Iran. We have people from African countries, and we're expanding our roster for the next academic year to even people who suffered under behind the Berlin Wall in the Iron Curtain countries. And so we are happy to send them at no cost. You can just go to our website, which is dissidentproject.org. You can also find me on social media. It's just Daniel Di Martino. That's my name everywhere. And, I'm an economist. I work on immigration policy at the Manhattan Institute. I'm a Novak fellow. And yeah, I support freedom because I lost it in Venezuela, and I don't want that to happen here or anywhere else.
Daniel Di Martino, thank you for all you're doing and for your time on the show. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Likewise.
And thank you, folks, for tuning in and supporting conservative voices like Daniel's, working to expose the truth about the rot spreading through this once great country. Remember that it's only by working together and by praying together that we can restore the United States of America and Venezuela to greatness under Almighty and Sovereign God. I'm Hayden Ludwig. Join us next time as the battle rages on.
First Right, a new kind of news summary without the liberal slant. Every morning, in your inbox, always free. Subscribe by texting First Right to 30161. That's First Right, all caps, one word, to 30161.